Strap in, folks, I've got some piping hot media takes and I am prepared to share them. There's been a lot of buzz about a new adaptation of Great Expectations, or at least as much buzz as a new adaptation of a 150-year-old book can generate, and the first episodes have been released for streaming. I actually heard about it last year. Not because I'm in the know vis-a-vis show business, but because they filmed a bit of it outside my mum's house and I got to hear a lot about how they dressed it to look authentically 1830s, and she was very excited about seeing her house on screen, so I was excited too. When I was first told about it, I was a bit confused about why yet another adaptation was being made. It's only been about 10 years since the last big budget all-star BBC adaptation that was suitably haunting and evocative, along with a perfectly competent all-star film version. I was even more confused that it was being written by Stephen Knight, the creator of Peaky Blinders and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. But hey, just because Peaky Blinders uses violence, self-bombastic monologuing and shock value in place of characterisation and decent plotting doesn't mean that he can't bring a fresh and nuanced look at Dickens' greatest work.
And so it begins. A common boy, now a handsome man. Innocent. Moments before the great corruption.
I'm looking for a boy by the name of Pip Gargery.
A secret benefactor gave me instruction to bring him to London and teach him. Teach me what? The wicked ways of this wicked city.
The devil will come.
You can break his heart.
All she taught me was how to be her weapon of revenge.
Look at me!
To be used against all men.
You cannot even think about marrying that idiot.
If you really want to win Estella, you will need more than love.
Do everything I tell you to do.
Hope your new boots are waterproof.
We are walking through water.
No. We'll be walking through rivers of blood.
Estella. What a prize creature we have fished from the river.
Okay. I think I get it. It would appear that this ain't your great-granddaddy's Charles Dickens. I'm not particularly the world's biggest fan of Charles Dickens. Although there were interviewers suggesting that there are no modern Charles Dickens fans, which is a weird take. And look, I might have otherwise simply ignored the show, apart from the bits that my mum would make me watch, so she can be like, that's my house. But I did read an interview with Stephen Knight where he explained his process, and he made some choice comments. Some very, very choice comments. Peaky Blinders creator Knight, who has previously adapted Dickens' A Christmas Carol, said, "What I didn't want to do, and I think Dickens never tried to do, was make something specifically political. He was never banging the drum. He was just saying, this is what's going on, and people could draw their own conclusions. You couldn't write about certain things in Dickens' time, certain elements of sexuality, crime, disobedience against the crown and state." He added to the Daily Mail, because of course it was the Daily Mail, "What I tried to do was imagine if Dickens was writing the story now and had the freedom to go to those darker places. What would he do? If he had been liberated to write the things that were going on he wasn't allowed to write about." Okay. This is the kind of ahistorical nonsense that I live for. Let's unpack these comments, shall we? Come on, Jess, it's not like you're saying Charles Dickens was influential to the political discourse of Victorian Britain. It's not as if a contemporary writer described Dickens as issuing more political and social truths than have been uttered by all professional politicians, publicists and moralists put together. Oh no, wait, it does sound like I'm saying that. And the author of those words? It's Karl Marx. Karl Marx said that. The Karl Marx. I mean, if Granddaddy Marx is saying this, I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that maybe he has a more accurate analysis of the impact of Charles Dickens than Stephen Knight. because it is a profoundly, utterly, gobsmackingly, how did you manage to read this book and miss all the political overtones? Because this is a book analysed at GCSE level, because it's perfect for introducing the concept of overarching themes, because they're that obvious. Wrong statement for Knight to make, to claim that Dickens never wrote anything specifically political. Charles Dickens, not political. The man who wrote the archetypal capitalism rots your brain parable. Dickens, who wrote Oliver Twist, a book that explicitly discusses how the new poor law had a disastrous effect on the urban poor, presenting how criminality was directly caused by desperation for survival and environment. Dickens, whose discussion of the economic impact of industrialisation, the working conditions of the working class, and the complete moral corruption of the wealthy elite is called literally Hard Times, because his working title of I shit you not, the state of things is so bad and I hate laissez-faire capitalism so much was, it's a little on the nose. Dickens was a humorist. Yes, he was a master of language and characterisation and plotting. He was also deeply, purposefully political in everything he did. His art was his vehicle for bringing about meaningful change. When asked whether he wanted to stand as a member of parliament 3 times, he was asked 3 times, he refused, seeing his literary output, his articles, his journalism, his speaking tours as being the greater means to reach those in positions able to directly improve society. As a child, Dickens had been forced into debtor's prison and knew the system from the inside out. As an adult, he worked as a journalist on the crime beat and covering parliamentary debate. Like no other, he understood how the system systematically failed those who were most vulnerable. He highlighted the willfully forgotten lives of the urban poor and how widespread class oppression gladly used them as a fuel to keep the furnaces of industry and empire going. The empire was a machine that needed a constant influx of workers to keep going, while blaming them for the implicit failures of the legal and public systems that rewarded a tiny minority while disenfranchising the rest. Dickens championed the need for education, prison reform, the importance of imagination, and that everyone deserves to have their inherent humanity recognised and valued. The human condition should not be reduced to material facts, statistics, and a bottom line that keeps going up, because money is not the same as value. Great Expectations is, not surprisingly, no exception to this. The whimsical and intricate machinations of the plot, centering on one Pip Pirrip and how everyone he knows are all tied together in a swirling web of revenge, coincidence and regret, I couldn't think of a third R word, allowed Dickens to skewer the class system and how the working poor suffer for the indulgence of the rich, while being offered the illusion that they may somehow stop being oppressed by lucking into the opportunity of becoming the oppressor. They never will, of course. Social class is a facade, but one built into the structures of society, and it relies on everyone trying to force themselves into a narrow slot right at the top. It does not reward those who work hardest, or who are kind, or those who are morally good, and it never will. Wealth and class are desired and necessary, while also corrupting those who have them, degrading their basic inner morality. And those who can't fit into the system? Chaff and gristle. Neither one thing nor the other, unable to find anywhere that will take them. Justice is blind, because those who have the means to avoid true punishment always will, and those who have not will always be crushed underfoot. Despite this, there is a great sense of hope in the human condition. The events of the plot are set in place because Pip does a kind thing with no expectation of reward. And by the end of his journey, Pip finds peace and contentment in meaningful, honest work, having escaped the belief that money and class give implicit worth to only a chosen special few. Even if none of that were true, and that's a huge if, because criticising the systems of law, class and society are, the plot. Stephen, mate, lovey, you've fallen into a terrible writing trap here. The belief that if you simply avoid putting politics into art, that means your art isn't political. It's almost trite to say that all art is political, but yeah, it is. What a creator chooses to discuss or not discuss displays a particular way of looking at the world, a set way of understanding it, an implicit statement on what's important and what isn't. The very act of trying to disengage art from politics is a political statement in itself. Stephen Knight took a book that is purposefully critical of capitalist, imperialist, unequal, laissez-faire 19th century Britain and didn't think any of that was political. For him, Great Expectations isn't about making any statements on anything. It's just a story. He hasn't written this with any intent about what the audience should take away from it. It's a story about nothing, and that says a lot about him. It's 162 years old, but Charles Dickens' masterpiece, Great Expectations, has never been more relevant, according to Peaky Blinders creator Stephen Knight. His 6-part adaptation of the Victorian novel for FX and Hulu takes the story in unexpected directions, as it follows the journey of orphan Pip, a working-class lad who loses his way as he chases wealth and status. Sex, opium, and attempted suicide crop up. Dickens wasn't able to write about certain things because they were considered to be not territory for fiction, says Knight. He could never go all the way into those dark places, so that's what I tried to do. Okay, I've got a great pitch for you, a great concept for a series. Great Expectations. It's out of copyright, so it's free, and we can attach Olivia Colman as Miss Havisham. She is so hot right now in the field of being the only permitted wacky woman over 40. But we've made Great Expectations. We've made 4 versions of Great Expectations in the last 60 years. Look, you've made us a lot of money in the last decade, so we're happy to sign off on just about anything you want us to make, no matter the quality. Maybe you should pick a different property. What about something new, like Jane Austen or William Shakespeare? Don't understand. This version of Great Expectations isn't going to be like any you've seen before. It's dark, gritty, edgy, realistic, gripping, dynamic, tense, nail-biting, innovative. All the adverbs from the adverb box mean that it's really clever, shocking and daring, which is the same as being good. Well, I'm sold. Have 6 episodes and as much money as you could possibly want with absolutely no oversight. I'm always deeply suspicious when copy for a TV show leads with the idea of the story being dark. You know, we can all laugh about the grimdark trend, justifiably, because it's awful and it's everywhere. From my perspective, I get deeply sceptical because it suggests a serious flaw in the writing process, where creators go in with the mindset of manufacturing a dark plot instead of a good one. Their priority is not telling a good story with meaningful stakes, well-crafted character arcs and meaningful resolution. It's about grabbing audience attention within the first few minutes with something shocking and generating enough media buzz to lift it from becoming yet more meaningless slurry in the oversaturated media landscape. Shock value has media currency at the moment, so showrunners and writers are looking for greater and greater returns with the shocks they can provide. If everyone's being shocking, what are you going to do? Take Stephen Knight's 2019 adaptation of A Christmas Carol as a completely random example. There is nothing new and exciting in making yet another version of the most filmed story of all time, so Knight decided to spice things up from the adverbs box. What have we got in the adverbs box today, friends? Scrooge was sexually molested as a child. Ooh, and he's going to sexually assault Mrs. Cratchit. I mean, Sure, these things happened in the 19th century, and sure, Dickens didn't include such things because of the limitations of publication at the time. Even though the book that's given for children was turned into a jolly musical features a teenage sex worker being beaten to death. But he also didn't because adding in pointless trauma that's not necessary for the plot or works to develop character does not make a story more realistic, gritty or compelling. Dark plot points are a cheap tactic that is used to artificially create a connection between the audience and the character. After all, who wouldn't be upset by a child being abused? Who wouldn't be sympathetic to a character who's been raped? We know that guy's the bad guy. Look at the horrific acts of inhuman violence he's done. There is also a certain immaturity on display. You know what it's like when you're a kid and you're first creating stories and you want it to be really super serious because you are a serious writer. You can handle serious topics, so you add in the most horrific things imaginable because they're dramatic and attention grabbing and real, man. Sex is real, addiction is real, selfishness and cruelty and things being bad are real. So that means any story containing them is serious and grown up and realistic. Audiences don't want picture perfect Dickens with singing and dancing and everyone being clean and tidy. They want grime, they want grey lighting, they want everything to be grim and miserable because that is realistic. That's what adult life is like. That's not the cheerful masterpiece image of period storytelling. There's a difference between reality and realism. Going in with a mindset of making everything dark, grim, dark doesn't make a story better or more realistic just because those things actually do happen. It makes a story much worse because it sort of destroys the element of why people love stories. The humanity of them. The ability to empathise. The ability to share across time and distance and text. A bond, a connection, a moment with someone. Great Expectations already has plenty of dark elements in it. It's just, a story about revenge and murder and the cruelties humans can inflict on each other. But it's also a story about hope and kindness and faith in your fellow human beings. And really, what does dark even mean? It's just a buzzword thrown around by media executives. Ted Lasso is a feel-good comedy that explores emotional abuse, mental health, anxiety and suicide. Those are all quote-unquote dark topics, aren't they? It would be easy to make it into a show about cataloguing the exploits of human misery. It's really easy to throw in acts of untold trauma and pain and never do anything with them. The hard part, the display of actual writing skill, is showing how faith and hope and joy and beauty are there too. That being said, I do want to highlight an addition that actually works really well. Estella in this adaptation is now a woman of colour, and that is a brilliant idea. Moving aside the cynical motivation of including diversity purely in terms of generating social media buzz, because yes, people of colour lived in Victorian Britain. That shouldn't be a surprise, but I do think showrunners are using the topic to create purposefully reactionary media cycles as a free source of marketing. Changing Estella's race really works to highlight the themes of the story. Those political themes that Stephen Knight swears aren't there. Having her as a woman of colour comments on the nature of British colonialism, especially as the story takes place at the time when slavery was being legally abolished in all territories of the empire. It adds extra nuance to Estella's role as a social outcast, trying to find a place within a stratified society that values birthright and blood heritage above all else. She has been reduced, in a very literal sense, to a piece of property being used by Miss Havisham and then passed on to someone else. It's no wonder she marries Bentley Drummle. His prestige, his whiteness provide that final stamp of belonging in a world that is looking for every excuse to reject her.
But you know what I mean?
If my grandmother had wheels, she would have been a bike.
I did watch the released episodes to get a fair sense of the show. I didn't want to be simply one of those talking heads complaining about something I hadn't seen because of the manipulated information that was released to make headlines. And I didn't want to prematurely judge the writing decisions made by Stephen Knight. I might not like Peaky Blinders or his version of A Christmas Carol, but I really did enjoy the writing for Spencer, and I found Locke to be a fascinating experiment in what you can do with modern film storytelling. The problem with holding writers up as geniuses is that people stop checking what they do. Even though their early works were subjected to editing and beta reading and revisions and changes for the tone and pace or whatever, they reach a point where somehow we stop seeing the parts that were necessary for their success as being necessary. Stephen King has a famous problem with endings. There's the bloated messes of Queen Bigot Rowling, whatever Stephen Moffat's allowed to do. Every problem I have with Peaky Blinders is on full display in Great Expectations. Bloated purple prose that has every character repeat the basic facts, their relationships to each other, their motivations, and metaphors that display their own brilliance. Pip starts the story as a conceited little arsehole who wants to become a gentleman because he hates living in his gigantic house that has every luxury and refinement, which is a misstep of such proportions that it fundamentally destroys the basic setup of the plot. Miss Havisham is stripped of all pathos and tragedy. She's just the villain now. She's a wacky addict written to counteract whatever you thought Miss Havisham was, because subverting expectations is more important than writing good stories. The key twist involving Compeyson and Magwitch is revealed in the first 5 minutes, because the audience is stupid and can't be trusted to remember key information of the story. A shocking lack of effort is on display in just about every aspect of the show. From the fact that every character, no matter their class and social background, has the same generic RP accent, to the fact that Joe Gargery's forge is a gigantic, massive, lovely, wonderful little cottage that doesn't add to his poverty at all, and that Satis' house is clean and tidy. Sure. The costumes are also not good. They are the type of Victorian that tries to appeal to a modern audience, thereby making them lose all uniqueness, contextual interest, and are grey. Because these people are poor. Miss Havisham's wedding dress, I was looking through all the promotional imagery because I just couldn't understand this wedding dress. I was looking at it and I'm like, this isn't an 1820s wedding dress, this isn't a Regency wedding dress, this is not Empire line. What is it with this gown? Did they try and be, ooh, like kind of with it? And I do think they used an 1820s basis. I think I know exactly which fashion plate they used as a basis, because when you Google 1820s bridal gown, something comes up that looks very similar to the costume, but the construction and fit is so bad, it's so bad, that it more closely resembles an Edwardian silhouette than the early 19th century. The construction around the chest, and they didn't know how to do the undergarments properly because these shows never do, and it just looks like a mess that they stuck an exoticized Chinese headpiece on because opium! There also aren't enough hats. Hardly anyone's wearing hats. I dislike it when period dramas they're like, oh, we want to appeal to a modern audience, so none of our characters can wear hats because no one wears hats these days. And I'm like, but they did then. I give this a definite frown crown for lack of hats. The only reasonable judgment of success in these things. There is one thing that Stephen Knight was right about. Great Expectations still holds relevance to the modern day. The best stories transcend the time they were written in because at their core they explore what it means to be human. It's why we keep telling the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, or Romeo and Juliet, or Gilgamesh. There's something in them that is just so universally human. And Great Expectations is about trying to find your place in a society that is capitalist, colonialist and class-based, where systems are used to benefit a moneyed elite while those who do not fit are thrown away because they're perceived as having no inherent value. But don't worry, none of that is political. There is no politics in Great Expectations. There is nothing even slightly upsetting that a critique of British society in 1860 is the same as a critique of Britain in 2023.
But you know what I mean?
If my grandmother had wheels, she would have been a bike.